3 days later, at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, Richard Bennett stood alone inside Daniel Brooks's law office. He looked out through the floor-to-ceiling window as the city slowly came to life. Thousands of people hurried to work. Traffic filled the streets. Coffee shops opened their doors. To everyone outside, it was just another ordinary Monday. But for Richard, it was the beginning of the hardest decision he had ever made. Daniel walked into the room carrying a folder. "Everything is ready." Richard turned around. "Are you certain no one can trace this back to us?" Daniel nodded. "We've followed every legal step. Bennett Group is financially secure. Payroll continues as normal, projects continue through the executive board, and only a handful of people know the truth." Marcus entered a moment later. He looked at Richard with concern. "We can still stop this." Richard gave a small smile. "If I stop now, I'll never know the truth." Marcus didn't argue again. He simply nodded. "If this is what you want, we'll stand by you." Richard took a deep breath. "For the next 30 days. He paused. "I am no longer Richard Bennett, the billionaire. I'm just a man who lost everything." Less than an hour later, every major news channel interrupted its regular programming. A breaking news banner appeared across television screens. Bennett Group founder Richard Bennett announces total financial collapse. Within minutes, the story spread across social media, business websites, radio stations, newspapers. Nobody questioned it. Richard had built his reputation on honesty. If he said he had lost everything, people believed him. Outside Bennett Group headquarters, reporters gathered almost immediately. Camera crews lined the entrance. Employees stopped walking and began checking their phones. Confused whispers spread through the lobby. "What happened? I heard the company is bankrupt. Does this mean we're losing our jobs?" One employee covered her mouth in shock. "I've worked here for 12 years. Marcus walked through the lobby calmly. He gathered everyone together. "I know many of you have seen the news." The room became completely silent. "I can't answer every question today. But I want each of you to hear one thing from me." He looked around the room. No one is losing their job today. A wave of relief swept across the employees. Some even began crying. Marcus continued. "The company will continue operating while we review everything." He couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet. Across town, inside the Bennett mansion, Ethan's phone rang non-stop. Friends, business partners, journalists. He ignored every call. Olivia rushed into the living room holding her tablet. "Ethan." He looked up. "You've seen it?" She nodded. "It's everywhere." Her hands were shaking. "It says Dad lost everything." Ethan immediately dialed Richard's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Olivia whispered. "Maybe he's with Daniel." Ethan grabbed his car keys. "Come on." An hour later, the two of them arrived at Daniel's office. The receptionist looked at them apologetically. "I'm sorry. Mr. Bennett isn't here." Ethan frowned. "When did he leave?" "I'm not allowed to say." Daniel eventually stepped outside. His expression remained calm. "I'm afraid I can't discuss Mr. Bennett's private matters." Ethan stepped closer. "Private? My father's entire life just collapsed." Daniel remained composed. Richard asked for privacy. Olivia's voice trembled. "Is he okay?" Daniel looked at both of them. There was genuine fear in their faces. For a brief second, he almost wanted to tell them the truth. Instead, he quietly replied, "He's safe. That's all I can tell you." Meanwhile, Richard sat inside a modest one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city. No mansion. No lake view. No expensive furniture. Just a small wooden table. An old sofa. A narrow kitchen. And complete silence. He slowly unpacked one small suitcase. Inside were only a few shirts. 2 pairs of trousers. A family photograph. And Margaret's wedding ring, which he had kept since the day she passed away. He placed the photograph on the table. Then looked around the empty apartment. For the first time in over 40 years. There were no assistants. No meetings. No luxury. Just him. He sat down quietly. The silence felt heavier than he expected. He picked up a notebook Daniel had given him before the test began. On the first page, he wrote, "Day 1. Today the world believes I lost my fortune. The real question is, what else will I lose? He closed the notebook. A few moments later, someone knocked on the apartment door. Richard wasn't expecting anyone. He opened it slowly. Standing outside was Eleanor Hayes. She held a small grocery bag in one hand. Richard looked surprised. "Eleanor." She smiled gently. "I know you told everyone not to visit." She held up the bag. "But I also know you skipped breakfast." Richard couldn't help smiling. "You've been looking after me for 25 years. Eleanor laughed softly. "And you still think I'll stop now?" For the first time that day, Richard smiled. Not because his problems had disappeared, but because someone had come. Not for his money. Not for his name. Simply because she cared. Richard invited Eleanor inside. She placed the grocery bag on the small kitchen counter and immediately began unpacking it. Fresh bread, eggs, milk, tea, a small container of homemade soup. Richard looked at her and smiled. "You really didn't have to do this." Eleanor turned toward him. "I know. But I wanted to." She paused before adding, "Your wife made me promise something many years ago." Richard looked surprised. "What promise?" "If anything ever happened to her, I should make sure you never faced life alone." Richard lowered his eyes. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Margaret had been thinking about him long before she became sick. Even after her death, she had somehow found a way to take care of him. Eleanor noticed the tears forming in his eyes. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "She would be proud of you." Richard smiled sadly. "I hope so." Across town, life inside the Bennett mansion was beginning to change. The house was just as beautiful as before. The expensive artwork still hung on the walls. The luxury cars were still parked outside. But something felt different. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt quiet, almost empty. Ethan sat alone in his father's study. For years, he had entered this room only to discuss business. Now he simply looked around. Every shelf held memories. Old awards. Family photographs. Letters from employees thanking Richard for changing their lives. One framed picture caught Ethan's attention. It showed him at 8 years old, proudly holding a wooden birdhouse beside his father. He smiled faintly. "I remember that day." His father had spent an entire Saturday helping him build it. Richard had cancelled an important business meeting just to keep a promise to his son. Ethan whispered to himself, "When did I stop remembering moments like that?" He slowly sat in Richard's chair. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about becoming chairman of the company. He was thinking about his father. Meanwhile, Olivia walked into the kitchen where Eleanor normally prepared dinner. Everything was spotless, but unusually quiet. She looked around. Eleanor. No answer. Only then did she remember. Eleanor had taken a few days off. Olivia opened the refrigerator. It was full of food. Yet somehow, the kitchen felt empty. She suddenly realized something. She had lived in this house her entire life. But she had never learned how much work Eleanor quietly did every day. She had never thanked her. She had simply expected everything to be done. The thought made her uncomfortable. Later that afternoon, Richard decided to take a walk. He put on a simple jacket and left the apartment. For the first time in decades, nobody recognized him. Without the expensive suits, without the luxury car, without security, he looked like an ordinary retired man. He stopped at a small neighborhood cafe. The young cashier smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you?" Richard ordered a cup of coffee. As he reached for his wallet, he realized he had left it in the apartment. "I'm sorry," Richard said with embarrassment. "I must have forgotten my wallet." The cashier smiled. "It happens. You can pay next time." Richard looked surprised. "You don't even know me." The young woman shrugged. "I don't need to. You look honest." Richard thanked her sincerely. As he sat by the window with his coffee, he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. A complete stranger had trusted him. Without knowing he was a billionaire. Without expecting anything in return. It reminded him of the kindness his parents had taught him as a child. Back at Bennett Group, Marcus and Daniel reviewed the situation. "The media still believes the collapse," Marcus said. Daniel nodded. So does the public. Marcus looked at another report. But something unexpected is happening. What? Employees are refusing job offers from competitors. Daniel looked surprised. They're staying. Marcus smiled. Many of them said the same thing. What did they say? Marcus looked at Richard's employee file and smiled. They said, Mr. Bennett stood by us during difficult times. Now it's our turn to stand by him. Daniel smiled quietly. I had a feeling that would happen. That evening, Ethan drove to the apartment address Daniel had secretly left in an envelope. He parked across the street. For several minutes, he simply sat inside the car, watching. Then he saw something that completely surprised him. His father walked home carrying 2 grocery bags. No driver. No assistant. No security. Just Richard. Walking alone. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. His father had carried the weight of an entire business empire for decades. Now, he was carrying his own groceries. Without thinking, Ethan stepped out of the car. Dad. Richard turned around slowly. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan walked over and quietly took one of the grocery bags from his father's hand. Richard looked at him. You don't have to. Ethan shook his head. I know. A long silence followed, as they walked toward the apartment together. Just before they reached the entrance, Ethan finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him since the news broke. Dad. Richard looked at him. Are you really okay? Richard smiled gently. It wasn't the smile of a billionaire. It was the smile of a father. I've had better days. He paused. But I've also had worse. Ethan lowered his head. I'm sorry I didn't ask that sooner. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Sometimes, the smallest gestures carried the deepest meaning. As Ethan walked back to his car later that night, he realized something. For years, he had admired his father's success. But only now, he was beginning to understand his father's heart. Back inside the apartment, Richard opened his notebook once again. He wrote, Day 4. Today my son asked how I was feeling before asking about the company. Maybe this test isn't changing their hearts. Maybe it's helping them remember the hearts they already had. Richard closed the notebook and looked out of the window. Across the city, the lights of Bennett Group still shone against the night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and a truth that would test every Q member of the Bennett family. The next morning, Richard woke before sunrise. For the first time since the test had begun, he didn't immediately reach for his notebook. Instead, he stood by the small apartment window with a cup of coffee in his hands. The city looked the same as it always had. People hurried to work. School buses picked up children. Traffic slowly filled the streets. Life moved forward, whether someone was rich or poor. Richard smiled to himself. His father had once told him, the world doesn't stop for anyone, son. That's why you must learn what truly matters before it's too late. Back then, he had thought his father was talking about business. Now, he understood he had been talking about life. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Marcus. Richard opened the door. Marcus stepped inside carrying a folder. Good morning. Richard smiled. You look like you haven't slept. Marcus laughed softly. I could say the same about you. Richard poured another cup of coffee. So, what's in the folder? Marcus placed it on the table. I thought you should see this. Richard opened it. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some handwritten. Some printed. Some written by children. The first letter was from a construction supervisor who had worked for Bennett Group for nearly 20 years. Mr. Bennett, I don't know what happened, but I want you to know that many of us are staying. You gave us jobs when no one else believed in us. If hard times have come, then we'll face them together. Richard slowly placed the letter down. He picked up another. It came from a receptionist. Thank you for treating me with respect from my very first day. Whatever happens, you'll always have my gratitude. Another letter. This one from a retired employee. People often remember wealthy men because of their money. I'll remember you because you attended my wife's funeral even though you had never met her. Richard closed the folder. His eyes had become moist. Marcus smiled. I thought you deserved to know. Richard nodded quietly. I spent weeks wondering whether people only respected my success. He looked at the letters again. These remind me that kindness leaves a longer legacy than wealth. Marcus leaned back in his chair. I think your father would agree. Richard smiled. I hope so. Across town, Ethan stood inside his own office. Stacks of paperwork covered his desk. Normally, he enjoyed solving business problems. Today, he couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept drifting toward the family photograph he had brought from home. It showed Richard teaching him how to ride a bicycle. He remembered falling, scraping his knee, wanting to quit. His father had knelt beside him and said, "You'll fall many times in life, Ethan, but never let fear decide when you stop trying." The memory made Ethan smile. Then his smile disappeared. When was the last time I thanked him? He whispered. He couldn't remember. A knock came at the door. Come in. Olivia entered. She looked exhausted. I couldn't sleep. Ethan nodded. Neither could I. She sat down across from him. I've been thinking about Dad. So have I. After a long silence, Olivia spoke again. Do you remember when Mom passed away? Ethan lowered his head. I remember. Dad cried after everyone left. I saw him. Olivia's voice trembled. But the next morning, he still made breakfast for us. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Then Ethan quietly admitted, I don't think I ever realized how much he carried alone. Later that afternoon, Richard received a phone call. It was Daniel. Richard, he said calmly. The board has requested an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Richard remained silent. Daniel continued. They want to discuss the future of Bennett Group. Richard looked toward the window. In my family. They'll be there too. Another moment of silence. Daniel spoke carefully. If you're going to end the test, this is the right time. Richard slowly nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see him. I'll be there. After ending the call, Richard sat quietly. Tomorrow, everything would change. The lies would end. The truth would finally come into the light. But one question still weighed heavily on his heart. Had his children truly changed? Or had they simply become afraid of losing him? That answer would determine everything. That evening, Richard opened his notebook one final time. He wrote, Day 30. Tomorrow, my family will learn the truth. Whatever happens next, I pray we leave that boardroom not as strangers connected by money, but as a family connected by love. He closed the notebook gently, placed Margaret's wedding ring beside it, and whispered into the quiet room. I've done all I can, Margaret. I just hope this brings our family back together. Outside, the city lights shimmered in the darkness. Morning was only a few hours away. And with it, the moment that would change the Bennett family forever. The next morning arrived with an unusual silence. At exactly 9 o'clock, the boardroom at Bennett Group was filled with directors, senior executives, company lawyers, and a few trusted advisors. No one spoke much. They all knew today would determine the future of the company, or so they believed. Ethan and Olivia sat side by side. Neither of them looked confident. For the past 30 days, they had watched their father's life change completely. Every night, the same question haunted them. Had they failed him? Daniel Brooks entered first. He looked around the room before speaking. Mr. Bennett will be joining us shortly. The room fell silent. A few seconds later, the boardroom doors opened. Richard Bennett walked in. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive designer suits. Instead, he wore the same simple navy blue suit he had worn throughout the past month. He walked calmly to the front of the room. His face showed neither anger nor victory. Only peace. Everyone stood. Richard smiled politely. Please, have a seat. After everyone sat down, Richard looked around the room. Then his eyes rested on Ethan and Olivia. He took a slow breath. For the past 30 days, the world believed I had lost everything. He paused. So did my family. The room remained completely silent. Richard continued. But today, I'm here to tell you the truth. Daniel stood up and placed several documents on the conference table. He looked toward the board members. There was never a financial collapse. Gasps filled the room. Daniel continued. Bennett Group has remained financially stable throughout the last 30 days. Every employee was paid. Every project continued. Every financial report remained healthy. One board member whispered. So, none of it was real. Daniel nodded. It was a carefully planned legal test approved by Mr. Bennett. Every eye turned toward Richard. Ethan looked completely stunned. Olivia covered her mouth in disbelief. Richard looked at his children. I didn't do this because I wanted to trick you. I did it because I needed to answer a question that had been keeping me awake at night. He paused. A father sometimes wonders if one day he can no longer provide, will his family still see him the same way? The room became painfully quiet. Richard continued. The night of our family dinner, I accidentally overheard a conversation. I heard discussions about the company, the estate, the mansion, the future. He lowered his eyes for a moment. But I never heard anyone ask, is Dad going to be okay? Ethan immediately stood up. His voice shook. Dad, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Richard looked at him gently. I know. But intentions don't erase pain. Olivia's tears began to fall. She walked toward her father. I've been thinking about that conversation every single day. I wish I could take it back. Richard nodded softly. So do I. She broke down crying. I'm sorry, Dad. I stopped seeing you. I only saw the life you had built. Richard opened his arms. Without hesitation, Olivia embraced him tightly. She cried like a little girl. Not because of guilt alone, but because she realized how close she had come to losing the most important person in her life. A few moments later, Ethan slowly walked over. His eyes were filled with tears. I've spent my entire career trying to become the businessman you are. He looked directly at his father. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to become the man you are. Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Success isn't measured by the size of your company. It's measured by the size of your character. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The room remained silent as father and son embraced. Even several board members quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus smiled. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Neither of them regretted helping Richard carry out the test. Richard looked around the room one final time. I've learned something over these last 30 days. Money attracts attention. Power earns respect. But kindness creates loyalty. He smiled. When I believed I had lost everything, my employees stayed. My oldest friend stayed. Eleanor stayed. He turned toward his children. And in the end, so did my family. Olivia smiled through her tears. We almost lost what mattered most. Richard nodded. But you found your way back. A week later, Richard announced a major change at Bennett Group. Instead of focusing only on profits, the company would launch the Bennett Family Foundation, dedicated to helping struggling families, funding scholarships for hardworking students, and supporting elderly people who had no one to care for them. Ethan volunteered to oversee the scholarship program. Olivia chose to lead the family support initiative. For the first time in years, they weren't working for an inheritance. They were working for a purpose. Months later, the Bennett mansion felt alive again. Family dinners returned. The grandchildren filled the hallways with laughter. Richard no longer rushed from business meetings to answer phone calls. He made time. Because he finally understood something his late wife had always tried to teach him. A family isn't held together by success. It's held together by presence. One evening, after dinner, Richard walked into the garden alone. He looked up at the stars. Holding Margaret's wedding ring gently in his hand, he smiled. We did it, he whispered. Our family found its way home. A cool breeze passed through the trees. Richard closed his eyes. And for the first time in many years, his heart felt completely at peace. Life lesson. Sometimes, the greatest wealth in life isn't found in your bank account. It's found in the people who still choose to stand beside you when they believe you have nothing left. Never become so focused on building a successful life that you forget to build meaningful relationships with the people you love. Because one day, your greatest investment won't be your money. It will be your family. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us what lesson you learned, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to this channel for more emotional stories. See you in the next story.